Hello. Today we would like to talk about two different type of events. We'll talk about the domain events and integration events. What's the difference? Alternative names. When it's a problem of using one or the other, and what are the symptoms of those problems. As always, I'm with Tomek here. Hi, Tomek.
Hi, Łukasz.
So, what other names do we have for those domain events and integration events, as we call them in the introduction?
Yeah, so usually when I was reading about them, I think I've seen the namings like private and public events. Less often internal, external, I think. But I'm not sure what are your experiences about it.
Yeah, my experience, what was mostly used was domain events and integration events.
Okay.
However, for me, it's like I prefer to call them private, as in private for certain bounded context, and public as an event that can be used by other bounded contexts. And we'll get to the difference, how you should treat them really soon. But what I want to also emphasize is that we are not thinking about events as the storing state in event sourcing. Today, we're thinking as an event as the something that is published, for example, to some service bus, and that is handled, and then maybe there are some decisions made based on what happened in the system, what facts, events happened in the system. So this is this
Yeah.
small distinction and keep that in mind today in this episode.
Exactly. On the low level, they will still be stored like in the event store, right? But it's more like it's about semantics,
Yes,
right?
in most of our setups they would be, but it's not necessary, because if you're not using event sourcing, but you are publishing events, then you may also have to distinguish between private domain and public integration events.
Yeah,
Right?
it's more about communication, right? Where
Yeah,
we used one and where another ones, right? In the
exactly.
context of bounded contexts. In the context of bounded contexts, contexts actually, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking today in the morning about that, and I thought, like, when is that a problem, and when you should actually start to separate those two events. So start thinking about the domain, private events, and public events. And sometimes maybe you'll never have to do that, because it depends on your team structure, on how complex is your application, how frequent are the changes, even if you're even using event-driven architecture to communicate between bounded contexts or modules, depending on how you call them. But that's one of the aspects. So maybe you'll never need them, for example, if you are a one-man army that works on small app, and all you have to do is to just introduce some changes here and there from time to time. And if you have some coupling between two events, or more likely between some two bounded contexts, right, then it may not be so problematic to change them, especially if you're thinking about the monolithic architecture in which you can deploy all the changes as just one unit, right? But
Exactly.
there will be situations when this is a problem.
Yeah. So the main problem here is if you like still using the domain problems to integrate between also different bounded contexts is when because you are introducing some kind of coupling between those bounded contexts, right? And one of them expose some kind of, let's say, internals to the other one, right? And maybe in some point of time in your project you will need to have this you will have to have some kind of very stable interface between those two bounded contexts, and that's probably let's say kind of symptom that you would like to have the dedicated, let's say, integration public event between two bounded contexts, right?
Exactly. Yes. So that's one of the aspects, and how you can find out that you actually have a problem. So let's go back to the one man army case. If you are one-man army, as I said, you may not need to think about that, at least in the beginning. You may not need to have to discuss the required changes or decisions with some teammates, right? You don't have to ask for integrations or for exposing certain data because you do it on your own. But when you notice that you need to modify some business process, or just maybe remove one event, and then this leads you to adjusting code in lots of places for just one small change, that may be the indication that you're leaking your domain knowledge out to the other bounded context. And then you need to use some kind of new abstraction to actually encapsulate those details and create, well, one of the solutions is to create a dedicated event for that, right? But it becomes even more problematic when the team is large, the product is large, and maybe there are some different services communicating via events on Kafka or on RabbitMQ. And if you imagine the situation that, for example, there is some bug because someone misunderstood the internals, right? Maybe they forgot to include the, some kind of discount in the pricing, right? So the price that customer actually paid may differ from the one that is on the invoice because of missed event, right? It may happen because of misunderstood internals. Because the reason is that if someone relies on our domain events, they need to understand the domain logic and all the correlations that make those events, right? And another example would be when you actually need to remove an event. And there are two scenarios. One is that you remove the event and the bug occurs in the other team's bounded context, or of the part of the app for which the team is responsible. Or to remove the event, you need to participate in 10 or 15 meetings, very unproductive, and discuss how you can do that. This may be the indication that you are actually in position to introduce some kind of public event with this or other implementation, depending on what you need, what's your team experience, and how good you're to establish some conventions, right?
Yeah.
Right. So we also prepared some symptoms that may actually trigger you into thinking, to start asking yourself if you should think about the public events.
Yeah, so it's basically when you, I think we also already mentioned that, right? When we have some kind of like
let's just
project, just a kind of project where we have like different teams that are really independent, they work independently, and they have to have some kind of contract interface where they communicate with each other, right? Their bounded context communicate with each other. Then you for sure would like to have something that not leak your, let's say, private internals from one bounded context to another one, right? And if you are in such position and have to have kind of a lot of meetings to, let's say, agree on some changes and so on, that's probably the moment when you really want to have this contract between those two bounded contexts, right?
Yeah, also if you replace meetings with a lot of written communication that takes days, it's better than meetings, but still it may just be an indication that you're in some kind of pathological situation when it comes to your events.
And That's one, and also the schema changes, right? For example, but I think we also mentioned
problems
that.
with schema changes, but also what comes to my mind is to also the need to sync the deployments, right? Especially if we have two different deployable units. So if you need to sync them and say, okay, let's, you can turn the up down and then deploy your changes, but nobody likes that, especially business. So then you're thinking, okay, my deploy takes 9 minutes, your deploy takes 12, we need to sync that. That's the indication of a big problem. Of course, you can use other techniques than trying to sync the time, for example, feature flags, but it is indeed problematic. Then you should start thinking of replacing your private events, just making this boundary more explicit, making this boundary stronger, and introduce some public events which are intended to be consumed and that are treated slightly differently, right?
Yeah, I think all those cases, and also like asking the owner of one bundled context to, let's say, introduce some kind of changes and so on. It all of them like what have in common is like there is some kind of coupling, right? There is always coupling between like in the software there have to be kind of coupling, but it's like all those symptoms are connected. How much we are coupled to event that is produced by different bounded contexts, right?
Yeah.
And if we see all those symptoms, let's say, that means that we really need kind of stable interface between those two, three multiple bounded contexts, and then you know that this contract should be the let's say public event that should not change too often, right?
And there are different. You can use the same techniques that you would use for HTTP API
exactly.
that is public to actually preserve the events schema and correctness of the data. So if you are familiar with that, versioning events should feel very familiar and shouldn't be that big of a challenge. So just another facade, let's say, or abstraction to deal with that problem.
Exactly. And I think that's it for today, right?
Yes, thank you for watching, and let us know in the comment if you ever had one of the described problems. If you do, let us know. Let's have some discussion in the comment section. Thank you for watching.
Thank you. See ya. Bye.
Bye.